Hello everybody and welcome to another faction guide for Rome to Divide et Impera. Today we're going to be looking at the Massilians, which offer a unique blend between Celtic and Hellenic units. Now, this cultural blend complements each other quite well because the Hellenes tend to lack a solid melee infantry. They don't have those loose fighting swordsmen and spearmen that made the Romans so dominant in their campaigns throughout history. But the Celts have those in spades, so the two actually kind of go together to cover each other's weaknesses. However, simultaneously, the Massilians don't have a particularly interesting skirmish roster, and their cavalry roster also leaves something left to desire. They don't have any shock cavalry at all, which is a quite significant weakness considering that shock cavalry are ideal for delivering those hammer and anvil tactics that Hellenic armies love to use. So without further ado, let's look at the start position for the Massilians and just check out whether you have it hard or easy in the early campaign. Alright guys, so this is the start position for Massalia, and as you would expect, you start out with Massalia. That's the only settlement that you have to start with, and frankly, I believe that in earlier patches of Divide et Impera, the Massilians started out with more than one settlement, or at least in the base game, I remember you started with like Massalia as well as Narbo, and I think that it's consolidated into a different province if I'm not mistaken, but regardless, we can ignore those discrepancies. What's important that you start out with one settlement in a province that's quite easy to take. Frankly, the Voke right here, they're going to declare war on you almost immediately. I just tried out a Massilian campaign for like 10 turns just to see what it's like, and the Voke declared war on me right after I ended turn for the first time. So they're probably going to be at your throats quite quickly, and frankly, if they're not at yours, I don't know why you wouldn't be at theirs, because you need Narbo. You need Narbo and you need Tolosa. There's absolutely no disadvantage to taking those settlements quite quickly. Both these factions have no allies. Both these factions use a very standard Gallic roster. And the thing is that as a Hellenic faction, you kind of have that technological advantage over any barbarian faction from the onset. So I would just recommend that you recruit your army as quickly as possible and go to war against the Voke here. Now for your early army, you're probably going to use a mixture of these Massilian hoplites. Of course, you need many of those. And for your melee infantry, I'd recommend that you just have these guys on the flank, these Massilian colonist levies. Don't let the word levy scare you. These levies are actually particularly strong for a levied unit. But 17 melee defense is significantly above average from what you tend to expect, and 10 armor is about as good as you'd expect on a levy too. So these guys are honestly pretty good, and for 62 upkeep a turn, they absolutely pay their keep. Have a nice center of these Massilian hoplites, which are pretty much just your average hoplite, which is good against Gauls at the beginning of the campaign, but are going to be scrapping by with whatever motley mix of tribesmen they can assemble. These semi-professional citizen warriors will absolutely destroy the Celts, without a doubt. If you want skirmishers, and you want skirmishers that can fight in combat, and you're willing to spend a bit more money, throw in these peltas. If you want cheaper skirmishers that serve the same missile function but aren't as good in combat, get these allied Gallic youths. They are almost half the price, so yeah, probably worth it to save money if I'm to be completely honest. Now when it comes to diplomacy, you have a chance to make trade agreements with many factions, although you already do have a trade agreement with the Romans, and you kind of have to decide at the beginning of your campaign what type of relationship you intend to have with Rome. Now, Rome obviously is going to expand very, very quickly. However, in its early stages, they're still quite beatable, and you start out in Massalia here with this Lacian, which allows you to train some basic naval units, although your navy, while not the most impressive in the ancient world, undeniably, you definitely can train enough troops to amphibiously invade the Italian peninsula early, and I've seen good arguments for just kind of rushing with Massalia. Like, just, take on the Voke and, the Voke and, I guess, Voke, okay, they're the same tribe, basically, but regardless, take these two guys on and then go attack the Romans right away. That's an option. I mean, you only have a trade agreement, which can easily be ruptured, but simultaneously, you're like the only faction that starts with a trade agreement with the Romans. And I can tell you what, if you want a non-aggression pact, they will give you one. You just need to pay them like a little bit of money, and I'll demonstrate that here, and you can get a non-aggression pact. And if you want a defensive alliance, then they probably won't give one to you ever, but...
This is a day of progress.
Actually, I mean, you almost have one. You're moderate there. I'm just curious to see, like, how much of a military... How close can we become militarily with the Romans right from the onset? Because obviously, if any ally you can have in the game, having the Romans is pretty solid. Let's see, now that we have military axis and non-aggression, can we get... No, still no defensive alliance, but we're close. Maybe if you sack one of these settlements, you can get a defensive alliance. I'm not so sure. So the Romans are definitely willing to be your friends if you wish. So it's really up to you. Do you want to grow with the Romans and maybe fight them later in the campaign after you've consolidated the majority of Gaul under your banners, or do you want to just simply go for Rome quickly before we become strong, before we get the reforms in and actually start developing swordsmen? Because early Rome can quite soundly be defeated by the Massilian roster if you play your cards right. So it's really up to you, although it's much safer to befriend Rome because they are a powerhouse and they are economically far stronger than you. But anyway, once you've defeated these guys, and I've already mentioned what type of army you want to assemble, and oh, one last thing, when it comes to mercenaries in your province, it's not really worth getting the Massilian hoplites here, but getting these mercenary Voce veteran riders is totally worth it, because this is like a solid medium cavalry unit. Like 38 armor is good, the melee stats are good. Like this is a really good cavalry unit, and you just won't get anything similar anytime soon. Also recruit these axemen when you see them. They are really cheap for what they bring. But in any case, if you're going to recruit a bunch of these guys, probably start out with levies, then move on to hoplites later. You're going to send out a scout to investigate these. And after you do that, if you don't decide to quickly rush Rome, you probably just want to head north and just continue to conquer the Gauls left and right. I don't particularly rate the Gallic early game rosters particularly well, and to be completely frank, the AI typically develops some really weird armies that are just unbalanced and not very powerful. If you have a full army of Massilian hoplites, then you'll be really good and absolutely primed to succeed and dominate. Now your buildings are pretty much just standard Greek buildings. However, you do have two barracks as you are a colonist faction. And as you can see, the other barrack is a Celtic barrack. Now for this, you're going to recruit the Celtic side of your roster. And I just want to kind of showcase here that you don't really get a whole lot of value out of it right away, other than these allied Gallic slingers that are going to be useful. And these guys are only like Furos reform units. So you have to wait a little bit for those. There's only once you get here, but you get these two. And these two are unlocked at the very beginning. Like, you don't need reforms for them. But you have to get all the way to the top tier allied Gallic settlement. And similarly, for your Hellenic roster, you can see you have to get to the very top here to get Massilian Noble Guard as well as your Massilian Noble Cavalry. So you kind of unlock your mid-tier units relatively quickly on the chain, but it takes a while to get your elites, and that's going to add some context when it comes to looking at the roster, because I want to kind of showcase it. There's some units that are really good but really challenging to get, and that is a little bit of a disappointment if you just want to get out those elite units but you can't really recruit them. But yeah, when it comes to expanding as Massalia, if you don't go for the Rome, you can quickly go north, conquer Aquitania. You can see over here that Arverni have gold, and you want to have gold. It's like the most valuable resource in the game. Yeah, you can just head north and expand quite freely, dumpster the Gauls. You can also head west if you want and get into Spain. That's kind of what your region of influence is. If you really do want to, you can declare war on Carthage when the Romans do and take Corsica and Sardinia, although the Romans probably won't be too happy about that. So if you're looking to befriend Rome, I probably wouldn't do that. I also would not expand into Cisalpania if you want to befriend Rome too. They might get a little bit antsy about you holding their north. So if you are going to go nice with Rome, just go directly north from Narbonne into Aquitania and just kind of stay out of their lane, if that makes sense. Be like a nice little companion to them, but don't be the main character if you want to befriend Rome, for Rome does not tolerate any other main characters. They are the narcissists of history. But anyway, guys, that's what it is when it comes to Massalia's journey on the campaign map and their start position. This isn't a particularly hard start position because nobody's really gunning for you that's powerful, and you do have license to expand across Gaul relatively quickly with your hoplites. I would classify this as a medium easy start position because you don't start out immensely wealthy or anything like that, but you have everything you need. And look at your population. 33,000 men, 4,500 polytides, and 1,500 Eugenes. So you have nobles and middle class people and spades as well. That makes it even easier, guys. That's a huge buff to what I perceived as just medium easy. You know, I think this is a relatively easy start position, to be honest. So long as you don't screw around with Rome, you should absolutely be fine. But anyway, guys, let's go look at the buffs and debuffs that Massalia has, and then after that, we can check out the roster. See you there. Alright guys, so when it comes to Massalia's buffs and debuffs, you get the typical ones that any colonist faction would have. This first one you can just ignore. Special population technologies means nothing, it just means you have 2 barracks. And you have plus 10% melee defense during battles in own or allied territory. Now that in particular is rather interesting. It is rather interesting because the Romans might attack you. Like, typically I don't rate this plus 10% particularly highly, but if the Romans do attack you, you can defend from Massalia relatively easily. So, I mean, there is that actually. That's kind of cool. That is kind of cool. When it comes to the war against Rome, you can maybe use this to game them a little bit. But outside of that, to be fair, it's not a very powerful buff. Now, when it comes to Massalia itself, you have a minor diplomatic bonus with Latin, Italian, and Celtic cultures, meaning all of the Celts will like you a little bit, and the Romans will like you too, naturally. And considering the importance of cultivating a good alliance with the Romans, having a good relationship with the Romans right away, this might actually be a pretty useful buff to you. Now, increased trade income is the next buff that you have, and that's actually pretty solid too. It's pretty solid too. I mean, you start out with a naval settlement, so obviously you're probably going to trade quite a bit around the Mediterranean, and having increased trade income could be solid, although trade is not usually the main source of income you're going to have in early game, but in late game you might feel the impact of that. Now, increased unrest or presence of foreign cultures does suck. This debuff does suck because you're obviously going to preside over a lot of Celts. I hope that's not a surprise considering that you're most likely going to conquer Gauls. So that's a pretty significant debuff, and it might still your growth a little bit as a faction. Because ultimately, if you have to kind of send armies, kind of keep them in areas you just conquered, stop them from turning over to enemy hands, then yeah, you might end up having a bit of an issue, to be completely honest. So that might hurt you a little bit, but ultimately, you kind of have like a solid group of buffs and debuffs here. It's kind of neutral, to be honest. I feel like the minor diplomatic bonus is a little bit of a luxury, but the rest of it might not really matter too much, and this unrest you can deal with too. It's just going to be a nuisance. But anyway, guys, that's when it comes to this stuff. Let's go and look at the rosters. Alrighty, this is the roster of the Massilians, and as you can see, it's rather sparing when it comes to cavalry for a Greek or Hellenic faction anyway. But the melee infantry options are relatively potent, and overall you can see there's a great amount of balance. Just based on how many units you have in each category, there's a great amount of balance throughout this roster. That's kind of nice to see. But in any case, when it comes to your generals, you have 3 options. You have your Massilian veteran hoplites. And these guys, they are available from turn 1, and same thing will be Massilian Noble Guard. And frankly, I see absolutely no reason to go for Massilian veteran hoplites compared to the Noble Guard. There isn't a single thing that the veteran hoplites do better. The only thing is that they're cheaper. But when it comes to your general, why would you skirt the costs of maintaining your general properly? That just seems a little bit ignorant in general. It just seems a little bit stupid. So I would either go for your Massilian Noble Guards. And to be honest, this is not a great hoplite unit. The Massilians are a little bit weird because they have a veteran hoplite, which is quite rare. In fact, I don't think I've seen it before amongst all the factions I've covered so far. So it is definitely rare to have like a weird like in-between elite and regular. However, it's at the cost of their elite being a little bit weaker than the rest of the elite hoplites. They're the same as the Molossian hoplites. They're the same as the Scythian hoplites. They have a 35 armor compared to a 38 that you would anticipate of most elite hoplites. So they're a little bit weaker, but ultimately, like, just by a little bit of armor, it's not a significant amount. Now moving on to your Massalia Noble Cavalry. These guys are an absolutely solid melee cavalry unit. They have 50 charge, so they can do your hammer and anvil. They have 38 armor, so they're quite resilient. 10 melee attack and 17 melee defense will ensure that they do well in combat. And 5 armor penetration is not bad. This is kind of like your generic elite melee cavalry. For price on this custom game is even 2,000, the most generic number. So frankly, this is just a solid cavalry unit. If you want a cavalry general, go for this. If you want a hoplite general, go for this unit. I would mostly just go for the cavalry general because I just think cavalry generals are a lot more useful, and they do die a lot less frequently than infantry generals. So I just think that it's a lot better to use the cavalry in most situations, but the infantry is better in a defensive battle, of course. So that's kind of a trade-off you have to anticipate here. Now, when it comes to your melee infantry, we're going to start off with the Ligurian infantry. And these guys are useless or worse than useless. I haven't decided which term to use on these guys. They are so bad. These are horrible, 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 man. These Ligurians, they should be ashamed of ever producing such a terrible, terrible unit. I mean, look, on the surface, 8 melee attack and 12 melee defense seems decent. It seems decent. I mean, a lot of early game infantry maybe have like 9 melee attack and 8 melee defense. I mean, that's like the Thracian one. That's the Thracian one. So why is this so bad? Well, keep in mind here that the horrible Greek infantry has 8 melee attack and 11 melee defense. So just because the numbers seem decent, you have to look at the rest of the picture here. And the rest of the picture is ugly. 12 charge bonus. This is like one of the worst charge bonuses I've ever seen on an infantry unit. This Levy Hoplite charges better. And these are supposed to be bloodthirsty Celts. Who neutered these guys? They don't know how to charge at all. Pathetic. 10 armor is not horrendous for early game, but considering this is a light unit with 150 men, it does ensure that they're a bit squishy. And the weapon damage of 21 is not too good. 2 melee AP is really bad. I mean, just in general, these guys just tend to roll over and die. And I've attempted to use them, and they have completely underperformed expectations in every single engagement that I had them in. I'd highly recommend that you stay away from the Ligurians. They're not a great unit. If you need cheap infantry, just go for these Massilian colonist levies. I mean, they have the same armor, but they have more men. They're cheaper, and they have way better defensive stats. Will actually last for a little bit of time. These guys might be more offensively competent. However, they just die really quick and run. I don't know what it is about them. Now, the Pharaoh swords, this is just your typical Pharaoh sword. I mean, every Greek faction has this, basically. And other than the Athenian one, they're all pretty much useless. I mean, look, it's like a hybrid of a skirmish and a sword unit. Because they're not, like, offensively competent with only 13 charge bonus. A good melee infantry needs a decent charge bonus. 13 is just too low. And 8 armor is very low as well. The Ligurians have better armor. They're terrible. Which is not a good unit. I mean, sure, they have decent enough combat stats on the surface of 23 weapon damage and the 9 melee attack and 14 melee defense always kind of makes them look decent, but they're just not. Now, this is kind of the first infantry unit that I'd actually recommend using consistently, and it's the Allied Gallic Heavy Axeman. It's just an absolute beast of an axe unit, and yeah, 9 and 11 for melee attack and defense doesn't seem great, but they more than make up with it with that 28 charge bonus and 14 melee attack. It's also a medium infantry, so they're not as squishy. Not as squishy as a lot of kind of more shock units are. And of course they have 1 volley of javelins, 3 speed, 46 morale, 25 armor. But it's just a very solid unit overall. It's a very, very, very solid unit, capable of holding a line in battle as well as just being a vicious unit on the flanks. Now we're going to excel mostly for like breaking through on the flanks. I mean, it says here, but they're for breaking through. If they don't break through and they're just meant to like hold a gap defensively, they're not going to do that well. But if you use them along the flanks or something like that, then they can be absolute potent tools for you to use. Now, these Gallic champions are very good, but mind you, You do need to wait till you get like a top tier Gallic barracks. So that's kind of the caveat when it comes to using these. In theory, you don't need any reforms to recruit them, but you have to wait till the very end. Now, the only thing I don't like about these Gallic champions is that they don't scare. It's like they're like naked. They fight with no armor. They have 10 armor. They have the same armor as a crappy Ligurian. Ligurians are like barely human, and these guys are gods. But they have the same armor. What gives? Now, just like most of these like naked fanatic type warriors, these guys do have phenomenal base morale. 52 is really high. And the charge bonus of 28 and weapon damage of 32 is godly. Absolutely excellent. But you know what? I tested these guys out, and they're basically combat-wise equivalent to this unit, the Scipio Praetorian Guard. With a clean charge, of course. With like a clean charge, and you know, they don't get wrecked by skirmishers and all that. Like, they can go toe-to-toe against these guys, and I'm not gonna say that they'll win, but they'll come close, which is pretty good. And these guys are ultimately pretty combat efficient, considering how much they cost, but you have to wait forever to recruit them. And the one thing, like I said, I just don't like that they don't scare. If they could scare units away and, you know, subsequently help break enemy lines faster, that would be great. But what they really are, because they don't do that, is just a really good shock infantry, but not as good of a shock infantry as like a late game Thracian or a late game Dacian Falxman or anything. You know, they're not using shock weaponry at the end of the day. So yes, it is a really good shock infantry that can also just hold its own in combat for a while, because of good base morale as well as good melee defense. But watch out for enemy slingers, enemy archers. They will turn these guys into mincemeat and make your really hard to recruit expensive Celtic champion useless. Now, moving on, you have the Celto-Hellenic infantry. You do have to wait till the Furos reforms to get these guys, but once you have them in your roster, they're just insanely good. This is such a competent unit. For like a mid-game unit to have something that does 13 melee attack and 11 melee defense, those are good stats. 28 weapon damage is awesome. 19 charge bonus is acceptable. But then 30 armor is amazing. And keep in mind that while being a heavy unit, while having some pretty good offensive stats, they still have a 3 speed, meaning that these guys are nimble across the battlefield. They move faster than Romans. They have a defensive formation. But just as overall a super duper duper competent unit. Are they going to dominate in a late game? No, but like, if you look at, say, the Bosphorian Kingdom, which was the last video that I made, they're late game 4-axe units. So something that you get literally, what is it? Like literally 80 turns later, right? Like the other side of the game. Like, comparatively, when you look at the stats, I would be surprised if the Celto-Hellenic infantry beats it. So this unit, while being a Furos reform unit, is already of the same caliber as like a 4-axe sword. Or like a 4-axe sword, like a similar to 4-axe sword unit. 4-axe sword adjacent, we can call it. So it's just an incredibly efficient, very cost efficient, very good, very versatile unit, but just does everything that it has to do. Now, moving on, once you get to the 4-axe reform, you get your Romanized infantry. And, like, again, comparatively to, like, a 4-axe sword. A 4-axe sword, which basically is the bedrock of any, like, Hellenic factions late game, except some, but can do way better, like the Bactrians or whatnot. Like, there's other examples, of course. But considering that the 4-axe sword is what you expect most of the time, these guys are just so much better. Like, you have 2 more melee defense. Let's open up like your standard 4-axe sword. Wait, no. Syracusans don't have the 4-axe sword. They have something way better. Let's look at your basic 4-axe sword here. I mean, these guys have 2 more melee defense. Actually, that might be the only difference. And better morale. That's so good, though. These guys are better than your typical 4-axe sword by a decent amount. They definitely beat them decisively. Like, this definitely shows the addition of Roman and Celtic heritage to these guys. For sure. It's just better than your typical 4-axe sword. And keep in mind, right, you have decent shock options when it comes to your heavy axeman and your Gallic champion, and then you also have a really solid Furos infantry, which, considering that the majority of Greek factions for Furos will probably just get like a Furo spear and a Furo sword, and that's it, basically. This is a really dominant unit. I have to admit, this Celto-Hellenic infantry is a far greater advantage than this Romanized infantry. Because these guys are just going to be so unmatched during the era before the Thorax reforms. They're going to be so damn good. But anyway, moving on to your spear infantry. It's kind of hard to discuss all of these guys because this is a Furos unit, which is kind of weird. And then this is, I mean, you get them at the beginning, but they're like the top of your chain. So it's like they're really good, but they're also really hard to get. And I don't even know like when you're really gonna get them in your campaign. You're gonna be pretty much midway by the time you have the technology to even recruit these guys. But anyway, just kind of looking at these guys, these colonist levies, they are pretty damn good for levies. They have good combat stats, like I mentioned. They're absolutely capable of holding your flanks in early game. In early game, when you're going to be mostly up against other levies, absolutely capable of doing it. And, you know, Verda's good for levies. That's all it really is. Ain't much else to say about him. Furo Spear, this is just your typical Furo Spear. Once you get the Furos reforms, they'll be good, but ultimately, you probably don't want much of these because you're going to have these guys. You don't need a super high barrack to recruit them either. Speaking of that, when you have your Furos reforms hit, you actually get these Celto-Hellenic spearmen, which are, combat-wise, an absolute improvement on your Phreo spears. As you can see, they do cost more, but these Celts are just so much more competent in battle and have more armor and all of that stuff, and they also have a defensive formation and stuff like that. Now, you don't have a Thorax spear. So these guys kind of replace that, but you basically sacrifice the Thorax spear in order to get another advantage during the Phreos reform. So if you just made a lot of money early game and you make armies that are centered around Celto-Hellenic infantry, axemen, and these Celto-Hellenic spearmen, you will be so overpowered, man. You will be such a beastly faction. But anyway, moving on to these guys. These guys are just insane, because for a 225 person unit, the stats on this just aren't half bad. They aren't half bad at all. Great. These guys are so good against cavalry, and they hit hard in the charge, have good weapon damage. Your combat stats just are excellent, but the only disadvantage is that they're quite slow moving. They only move at a speed of 2. So it's just kind of like these guys ultimately, you're kind of okay. Honestly, by the time that you even are able to recruit them, you'll be able to recruit the Celto-Hellenic spearmen and these swords. I don't feel like you're going to use these guys a whole lot in your campaign, to be honest. And to be honest, like, even when I kind of view them, and I know that they're more expensive than your Phreo spears, you recruit from a higher class than your Phreo spears, and they have the same, actually they do have the exact same armor. To be honest, you know, I gotta take back what I said. I think the Phreo spear is way more versatile. But for additional speed, extra javelin, and cheaper, I would just go for the Phreo spear. If you want combat efficiency, go for your Celto-Hellenic spearmen. Like, if you're just trying to choose, like, okay, what do I want on my flanks? You know, if you want something versatile that could skirmish a little bit and kind of assist, or just hold men off, but maybe not be like the killing blow, get the Phreo spear. If you want something that's actually going to fight well, get your Celto-Hellenic spearmen, obviously. Now, moving on to your phalanxes, right? You have 4 phalanxes here. Your levy hoplite, absolutely normal unit. Never recruit these guys unless you're desperate. You know, at the end of the day, basically every faction that has hoplites has a levy hoplite. So I'm not going to go over these. They're such a ubiquitous unit. Now, your Massilian hoplite is an absolutely average hoplite. You guys have the same stats as virtually every hoplite in the game, which means that they're solid, but also average and nothing special. But considering that you're in Gaul, you know, you're going to be fighting a lot of, we could say, Celtic spear walls. At least the better factions are going to bring a set of spear walls. And let's just see how you compare to that. Let's like kind of look at your early phalanx here. Yeah, let's kind of look at this early Gallic shield wall spearmen. And you can see here that statistically, they're just far better in most stats. Other than armor, you do have 10 more armor. And I believe better morale. Nope, worse morale. I lied. Weapon damage. Weapon damage is better for the Celt. This is actually weird. It's actually very odd because the Celtic one is cheaper. I assume that the phalanx formation has better buffs. That's my assumption. Because the shield wall, it always feels a little bit flat when you use it. But I hope that this also does demonstrate that you can't just plow through Celtic lines with ease of these Massilian hoplites. I mean, when I was playing my campaign and I fought against the Voke and, you know, the first two factions near you, they brought a very, very, very strange mix of mostly melee infantry. They didn't really bring a lot of phalanxes, but if you do see your enemy deploy phalanxes, you know, your Celtic foe deploy phalanxes, you gotta give them a little bit of respect. Because these Massilian hoplites, I mean, as you can see, statistically, they're not better. You know? Unless you really believe in the supremacy of Greek people. You're not gonna do better, because factually they're not. Now, your Massilian veteran hoplites are recruitable with a higher barrack, and these guys are an interesting kind of midway between your regular hoplites and your nobles. Usually you just jump right to it, but the Massilians are unique, and they have a interesting veteran hoplite. And the veteran hoplite upgrades on a bunch of stats: 1 more melee attack, 2 more melee defense, a little bit higher charge. I mean, it kind of gives you a little bit more of everything. So obviously, bring these if you have the money for it. They do recruit from the same population class as from your population 2. You just need more money to pay them, and you need more money to recruit them, and you need, you know, you need to have a better barrack to get them. So you won't have access to them turn 1, but within a couple of barrack improvements, you will. Now, your Massilian Noble Hoplite, that kind of lies at the top of your chain. Like I mentioned, this is not the best elite hoplite in the game by any means. It's actually basically in the weakest class of elite hoplites that have slightly less armor, but that's not a huge deal. These guys will outperform the veteran hoplites. They are your best hoplite. They're actually, at least in terms of cost, your most expensive infantry. So therefore, they should realistically be your best infantry. So I'd probably take me sword, but regardless, these guys are decent. Take them if you want. I mean, if you do end up in a big spear fight with the Arverni or a faction like that, you might very well need these guys. But ultimately, don't let this statistical thing scare you too. I mean, it actually surprised me, but ultimately, I believe that it's phalanx formation just gives you way more buffs. But what this does prove, though, is don't engage these guys outside of phalanx formation or else you're going to get wrecked. But yeah, moving on, your missile infantry. This is definitely a significant weakness when it comes to the Massilians, by the way. There's nothing here that's really exceptionally good, and I mean, why would you expect it? The Gauls are hardly known as the masters of the skirmish. Never been known as that. Now, you start out with this bow unit, and I would recommend that you never even look at this bow unit, you never recruit it, you never touch it, you never even consider this bow unit. Because it has the worst stats of any archer in the game I've ever seen. I think the reason why is that they have this, like, this hide ability, so, like, basically, if this archer is in, like, behind some tree lines, and the enemy are kind of just, like, far away, the archer can shoot without the enemy detecting them. Like, literally, you'll just be sniping the enemy. But it's very unlikely to ever be useful, and these guys have less range than your average archer, and less missile damage than your average archer, while still posing the crappy 1 armor and the really bad 30 morale. These guys are cheap, but they're not even worth the money that you paid. Never even bring these guys, never look at them, never think of them. Now, when it comes to the 2 Celtic skirmishers that you have, you start out with the allied Gallic youths, and these guys are a decent skirmisher, but they really are just a basic regular skirmisher. They have very low armor, but they do have good charge bonus and high armor penetration, meaning that these guys come at you with axes. So at the end of the day, if you need to use these guys to charge a flank or something, they can do the business, but don't try to charge these guys in as like a main line or anything. Like, only use these guys as like little rear charges or something like that, because otherwise they're just going to break. It's a reasonable skirmish unit and it's cheap. So if you're just looking for a cheap skirmish option, these guys are worth bringing. If you want to, you know, get something a little bit more expensive, you can get these guys. Benito's Skirmisher. Now, Benito's Skirmisher has excellent javelin throwing abilities. It's basically as good as it gets. 95 range and 22 missile damage, unless you're looking at like a very elite unit. And this is as good as it's gonna get. Now, when it comes to your melee capabilities, these guys don't charge as hard as your allied Celtic youths, but ultimately they are more competent when it comes to melee, undeniably. They have higher melee attack, higher melee defense, higher weapon damage, but not the same armor penetration. To be honest, this is more of a better skirmisher, and even though these guys, they can kind of hold on in melee longer than these guys, they're still not going to do a great job because of 30 base morale and 1 armor. So I almost prefer these guys in melee just because they'll just charge in with a 24 charge bonus, and sure, they'll die in droves if you hold them in melee for long, but at least they'll kind of give you that, like, really hard hit on the charge, and I feel like that's all you can really expect the skirmisher to do max, at least a cheap skirmisher like this. So to be honest with you, I feel like the rule of thumb here is that these Aravachi Nido skirmishers, they're just for like actual skirmishing, like you're trying to bring a better Peltis style unit. If you're looking for a better fighter but you don't have money for Peltis, then bring the allied Gallic youths, and that's the trade-off here. Now, you have one slinger here, and it's the allied Gallic Slingersher. God, I said Slingisher. Skirmisher and Slinger combined. Wow, that is new vocabulary I've just unleashed into the world. The Slingishers. But yeah, so the allied Gallic Slingers, they have a range of 190 and missile damage of 11, making these guys an excellent slinger. Sure, they have base morale of 30, sure, 1 armor, but, you know, the raw ability to sling here is basically what you look for in a slinger, and these guys do pretty well. Don't really look at their combat stats. These guys aren't going to do anything in combat beyond die and slow something down, but they do sling well. So if you're looking for an actual long-range skirmisher, these are your only options, but they're an okay option to have. I mean, there's lots of cultures that can recruit a 90 range, 11 missile damage slinger. Everything from Judean slingers to Bactrian slingers to Greek slingers. I mean, there's just so many, okay? It's very, very, very usual. Actually, the Greek slingers have 11 damage, right? I know I'm getting a little bit sidetracked here. I'm just kind of... Yeah, they do. They do. They do. So basically, it's just like a, you know, it's a normal good slinger, but there's plenty of slingers that don't have the 190 range or an 11 damage. So yeah, these guys, they're kind of a solid middle of the range slinger. You know, they're far from an elite slinger, but they're like a solid, competent slinger, so they're worth using. And then you have your basic Peltis. These are the Peltis options that every Greek faction have. There's nothing special about the Massilian version, but if you want a competent, stable unit that can throw your javelins and then go get into combat, these guys are your guys. They're useful, they're helpful. You know, even though these guys are common, there's a reason why they are common, because they are exceptionally good and versatile at what they do. Now, moving on to your cavalry, this is where the Massilians are maybe a little bit weaker, but simultaneously they do have some pretty good cavalry options, some pretty solid cavalry options that aren't too expensive either. The thing about Massilian cavalry is that they don't break the bank, and you can see that reflected in the prices. But to start out, you have your first Celtic cavalry when you recruit. You get this with, like, I think the first Celtic barrack building, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe number 2, but you get these guys pretty quick, as you would expect. They have the fire whilst moving ability, which is really weird, but, you know, they have 0 ammo. But it is cool that your lowest tier cavalry right here, actually I think this comes from barrack number 2. I think that this light horse comes from barrack number 1, but I digress. These guys are actually pretty good at melee combat, sporting 9 melee attack and 15 melee defense, a charge bonus of 48, it's nothing to slouch out for a unit like this, and 26 weapon damage is good too. In all honesty, this is just kind of like a cost-effective mid-tier to low-tier melee cavalry. Sure, they're not going to like beat elite cavalry in combat, and you wouldn't expect them to because these guys aren't super expensive. But when it just comes like to bang for buck, comes to bang for buck and you're just trying to kill enemy cavalry or deliver a cost-effective hammer and anvil, these guys are great. I would deploy lots of these guys during my campaign as the Massilians, if I would play one. Now, moving on, if you want to spend a little bit more money and dive into your Greek population, you have the Massilian citizen cavalry, and these guys have the same exact stats as virtually every Massilian cavalry in the game, or every citizen cavalry in the game. Wow, words are hard. Words are hard, but seriously though, these guys have the exact same stats as virtually every citizen cav in the game, and as you can see, the difference between these two units is mainly just in armor. In terms of actual combat stats, these allied Gallic Mighty Horse are better. So if I'm going to be completely real here, I would take the Gallic Mighty Horse over the Massilian Cavalry. They're just a more interesting unit. They charge harder, they fight harder, they have better morale. And also, this Massilian Citizen Cavalry is not disciplined, so this Gallic Mighty Horse is actually significantly less likely to rout as well. So, because of those reasons, I would just go for the Mighty Horse. I think that this is just an amazing, cost-effective unit that can kind of carry your campaign. Now, as you go later in your campaign and you get better barracks, you can recruit these Celto-Hellenic cavalry. And, you know, once you have this, and if you have the money, you replace your Mighty Horse with these guys, because they are just exceptionally good. They offer high armor, very high armor, combined with relatively good movement speed at 6, not a very, like, high 6, because some units that move at 6 speed move quicker. You can actually see like the bar going down, but it never remains the same between the Citizen Cavalry and the Celto-Hellenic Cavalry. But these guys are armored to the brim. 38 armor is an elite statistic when it comes to armor. Their melee attack and defense is solid, so we have the fighting capacity of the Mighty Horse. But simultaneously, they are more armored than the Citizen Cavalry. So these guys just in general are super duper good. Like, I would absolutely love these guys. They just combine the best of both worlds of your lower tier options, and simultaneously, just in the grand scheme of things, it's just a super solid, super decent cavalry unit. Now, if you have even more money and you want to dive into your upper classes, you can get your Massilian Noble Cavalry, and as you can see, the numbers, your statistics just jump up. This Noble Cavalry is super duper duper solid. I mean, they can just compare it to, you know, the noble elites of virtually any faction in this game, but, you know, they're not a shock cavalry. I think maybe we have a slight bit less armor than some other noble cavalries that are melee based, but still, it's just a very, very, very solid unit. And really nothing much to say. Like, this is not a shock cavalry, so they're not going to dominate on the hammer and anvil, although 50 charge bonus is still plenty decent. But this ultimately, they're just a jack of all trades, very, very good cavalry, and there's really nothing else to say about them. Recruit them if you have the funds, they'll serve you well. But, you know, up against the most elite cavalry factions in the game, we're not going to be winning against them. And then once you get your 4-axe reforms, you get your Massilian heavy cavalry, which is upgrade the nobles. It costs a little bit more for it. Now, when it comes to missile cavalry, none of these options are insanely good. If I'm to be real, none of them really are. Poor base morale definitely is going to keep these guys from being exceptionally combat effective. The heavy Ligurian cavalry is interesting because it's a medium missile cavalry, yet it travels at an 8 speed. It's an armor of 28 and some okay melee attack stats. So if you're one of those people that really likes the hybrid units that can do melee as well as skirmish a decent amount, your heavy Ligurian cavalry are probably a pretty good bet. But ultimately, I wouldn't really consider either of these. I just don't think that they're really good bang for buck. These guys do have pretty good statistics, as you can see here, but 13 armor is going to haunt them. So, like, what's the point of being so powerful in melee when simultaneously you're just going to die in droves? These guys don't have, like, large shields or anything like that, so if I saw these guys on the field, I would just target them extra hard and just annihilate them, to be honest. But anyway, that is your faction here. That's your roster. If you're trying to just compare these guys to other Hellenic factions, I do feel like this is one of the most powerful Hellenic factions in the game. Like, I think compared to, like, Sparta and Athens, Rhodes, you know, all of the classics, we could say, the OGs, These guys are better because this melee offering just adds so much dynamism to them. And unlike, say, the Bosphorus Kingdom or the Cimmerians, whose infantry is kind of sickly, weak, and just in general is like a little bit lackluster, like you just have like a really weird assortment of infantry that don't complement each other very well. In contrast, you just have so many solid options here. Like these top 4 melee infantry all have their own unique and important uses, and you can just pop off of them. Your spear infantry, I mean, none of these are like game changing, but they can all play a solid role in your army. Particularly this Celto-Hellenic infantry during the brief period of the Furos reforms, when they might end up becoming tyrants on the field of battle. They might just be able to outmatch all of the less armored spearmen. But of course, these retinue spearmen, they can do damage too. Being of a medium mass and 225 men is pretty unique, so that is quite cool. These veteran hoplites are an interesting midpoints as well, so you don't have to abuse your noble population on these noble hoplites. You can just kind of, you can honestly just live with these guys. The nobles don't improve. I mean, they improve on a lot, but these guys, they'll play the same role. Like, at the end of the day, when it comes to phalanx battles, you kind of just, you win or you lose, and it's pretty decisive at the end of the day. When it comes to missiles, I just stick with either Peltis or the slingers, ideally. These guys, if you're going to go cheap, and for cavalry, just get whatever you can afford. But these guys are for if you're cheap, these guys are mid, and these guys are obviously top shelf. When it comes to how powerful this faction is, I would rate them a solid 7 out of 10 personally. I think that they combine some excellent troops together, and really the only weaknesses are that they don't have pikes. You know, if you're going to go for phalanxes, ideally a faction has pikes, but most Hellenic factions don't have pikes. That's just for the successor kingdoms generally, so it makes sense. At the end of the day, yeah, it's a lack of pikes that definitely screw them over. It's a lack of missile units, you know, an elite missile would be nice. A decent archer would be nice. Sometimes you want to bring archers. It's kind of a restraint that's weird. And, you know, when you're only able to use slingers, sometimes slingers just feel kind of lackluster, or just the battlefield, the terrain just doesn't suit them either. And it kind of forces you to bring skirmishers in this case, which not everyone loves skirmishers. I'm not a huge skirmish fan. Instead of bringing skirmishers, I usually just bring something like Furrow swords instead, even though I'm not the biggest fan, just because you can skirmish with them. Might as well. The other thing, of course, is that your melee infantry, while extremely competent, it's not like elite, right? We're not talking about, you know, top shelf Romans. We're not talking about even like Seleucid Silver Shield swordsmen. I think it can wipe the floor with this Romanized infantry. But it's still very good. So I think a 7 out of 10 is fair. These guys are powerful, but they're definitely not anywhere close to broken. We're just a very solid faction. When it comes to how much you need to play this campaign, it all depends on how much you want to explore the Gallic region. I feel like some people would love to be kind of enmeshed with the Celtic peoples and fighting them. But maybe they just like Greek culture so much that they kind of want the comfort of, you know, the Greek phalanxes and all of that. But if you don't care about the region at all, I don't really see why you'd play this campaign. You're hardly the most, definitely not the most interesting Greek faction, I can tell you that. So, you know, you have to be here for the Celtic part. You really can't be here for the Greek part. So, I mean, you've seen, even like gameplay mechanic-wise, the Celts have their own versions of the phalanx. So, you know, at the end of the day, if you just like Celts, might be a better options too. But this is definitely an interesting little hybrid here. So when it comes to how much you need to play this campaign, I'd probably give it like a 4 out of 10. You know, there isn't a ton of historical relevance when it comes to Massalia. I don't think that they're on everyone's top interest list. And like I mentioned here, it just depends on how much you like the region. If you really like Gaul and Iberia and stuff, it's definitely an interesting campaign for you. I guess also you are in kind of the unique place of potentially being an ally of Rome. There aren't that many campaigns where that's even really an option. The Romans do tend to be kind of snobby, but because you do start out with relations from the very onset, it kind of facilitates that relationship, right? So that is interesting. Maybe I'll move it up to 5 out of 10 just because of that. It's kind of cool to be allies of Rome, but a perfectly average campaign in terms of how much you should play it. 7 out of 10 in terms of power. In terms of how hard it is, though, it's not a super hard campaign. You know, I can tell you, particularly in early game, Celtic armies aren't super strong, and you know, it just has to do with what they recruit. They always recruit some really terrible levy units and stuff, like I mean, Ligurians, right? Like, they'll recruit their own versions of the Ligurians in large amounts completely obliviously, and you can just pulverize them with your phalanxes. So, it's not a hard campaign, I can tell you that. I think in terms of difficulty, I'd give it a good, like, 3 out of 10. It's actually a pretty easy campaign, and I think the start position is even classified as easy, or no, it's normal. I think in the base game it's easy, but I'd say it's easy. I feel like the difficulty is like 3 out of 10. So that's really all there is to it. I feel like some people are going to be really interested in this campaign. I feel like it's also not going to be everyone's cup of tea, but ultimately it's completely up to you and how you view the Celts and if you're bullish on them or not. But that's it for this guide. I'm getting close to the end of all the Hellenic factions, but I'm definitely going to be pushing through, and I do intend to do all of the factions, so stay tuned and like and subscribe if you like the idea of that, and yeah, I'll see you later. Bye for now.